You may have noticed that in the last example video about CSS, we really only covered style. We're able to change the appearance of the different elements that appear on the page, but we didn't try anything else. In fact, CSS really allows you to mess with two different things, style and layout. It allows you to position things on the screen. What I'd like to do now is walk you through a little bit of some of the more advanced options with CSS for positioning. As I mentioned before, this actually gets really deep. You can do a lot with this, so we're not going to go too far with it, but I did want to at least expose you to it. First things first, I've created a new example file here, example8.html, and in this we are I've just set up the basic boilerplate HTML that I've done before, so if you want to take a moment to get that set up for yourself, go right ahead. The other thing I've done is I've linked in a style sheet, example8.css, which is sitting right over here. Nothing's in this yet. It's just there for us so we can put our CSS where it belongs. So we're going to work in these two files this time. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the positioning options that are available, or some of the layout options. Now, I do also want to point you over to, you'll find links to all of this on the course website. The w3schools.com CSS tutorial has a lot more information here that will go well beyond anything I've talked about. It's very much worthwhile digging through this if you haven't done much CSS before. It's not expected that you'll do everything in here for the class, but it's certainly worthwhile exposing yourself to this. One thing I highly recommend paying attention to, and this is talked about in the book as well, is the box model. This comes up all over the place. You've got the margin, border, and padding. These are three separate things to think about. They're all things that you can engage with CSS, and so every single element that you can put on a screen always has a box model. For now, let's go ahead and talk about two very important things that often get used fairly extensively when you're dealing with CSS. We can, of course, do standard sort of positioning, standard sort of text typed into the formatting tags that we're already used to. You can see here I've got a paragraph that I'm creating, as we do that, we're able to apply styling to the entire paragraph if I wish to do that. So I could, of course, come over here. Let's give this an ID so that we aren't styling all of our paragraphs. Para 1 we'll call it. And then I can come over here to select an ID. I use the pound. And then let's give it the rule, let's say font size, and take this up to 15. And then a semicolon at the end of that rule. Come back over here. That's actually a little smaller than the default. Let's go bigger then. Let's do like 25. Boom. There we go. Now it's a little bigger. So we can certainly do that to the tags that we already know about. But occasionally, we might like to apply styling to something smaller than that. In this case here, we have just the word paragraph. Let's say that we'd really like to style only that. In order to do that, I need to be able to select it. But I have no way to select something smaller than a tag. If it is not surrounded by a tag itself, I can't select it. For this, we have a couple of new tags that sort of enable this for us. And really the purpose of these tags is simply to enable you to apply CSS to things smaller than a tag by giving you tags that by themselves don't really do anything. The first one, and the one that's the simplest to use, is span. Span basically says put something around this content right here. It's not going to change the content at all. So by putting a span tag around that one, nothing changes on the page. I go over here and refresh. I don't see anything different. But now I can identify just the word paragraph. Call this para word. And I can come over here and style just that word. And let's say I want to make it red. There we go. This is the simplest way to be able to style things that aren't already surrounded by a tag. Place a span tag around it, and that span tag won't affect it at all. It doesn't cause any sort of new meaning to be given to that area, but it does enable you to put an ID or a class on it if you wanted to. For example, I could say emphasize. And then I could use that and change that to be a class. And anytime I want to emphasize something, then I can surround it with that tag. So we could go over here and also do that to the word this. Close that out. And then over here, let's change this instead to be a class. And now anything that has the class emphasize is going to be in the color red. So now it's applied to both of those things. This really allows you to create a style. Oftentimes this is the way you think about it. I say that anything that I've said to emphasize, make it red, and then apply that liberally wherever you want to apply it. Now the span tag really does nothing else. It allows you to attach classes or IDs to something smaller than the tags we're used to. There is another type of tag, and this is called the div tag, which is usually short for division. Where a span is kind of something that spans across an existing area. A division is actually a whole nother divider. So let's take a look here at the difference between span and division. I'm going to change this second one to a div tag instead of span. And let's see how it renders slightly differently. Notice now that paragraph, which we put inside a div, kind of got pulled down on its own line. Basically, it turned into another block. What happens is div behaves like as if it's another division or subdivision of the page or of the content, and it basically breaks out of the paragraph and starts a new one. Div is just like span, except it's treated as and formatted the same way that P is. And in many cases, you can actually interchange P and div, but most of the time you want to have a reason for it. You'll notice here, putting a div inside a P just doesn't work. So it gets upset about that, and that makes sense. You really shouldn't ever be doing that. So let's change this back to span rather than P, and make it happy again, and get our page back looking the way it was. What's really going on here is that the two of these have slightly different display styles. The standard display style, the one that's applied to span, is something called inline. And what's applied to div is what's called block. Let's take a look at these two. I'm going to go over here to the CSS tutorial that we have. And if we look in through here, we can see that one of them is display. Display itself is either block or inline. Those are the two that you can do. Now there is no default. In fact, the default differs depending on which tag you're using. So for block level elements, the most generic one is div. Anytime you use a div, you're essentially at a block level element. All of these other ones, the H tags, P, form, header, footer, section, these are also block tags, but they're a little more specific about what they do. Of particular note here is the form one. You might not think of that as being a block level element. If you surround something by a form, it will actually affect the formatting of it, so keep that in mind. The rest of these, you pretty much expect that these would be blocks and that they would cause a sort of subdivision between subsequent ones. So multiple paragraphs followed by one another, yes, there should be a break between those. Header, footer, section, yeah, there should be breaks between those. So block level elements are essentially ones that have a break between them. You'll notice here they put a div element right in the middle of this, and notice how that div element gets broken out on its own line. Inline elements, on the other hand, are things that do not go on a new line and just stay right in line with everything else around them. And that's the span is the most generic version of that. This is an inline span, surrounded by green here. It just continues right inside of the paragraph. It doesn't break to a new line. The three that default to that are span, A, and IMG. A is the anchor tag. You should have already played around with that a little bit. IMG is for bringing in an image. Now that might be a little bit counterintuitive. Images themselves here, what are they? Well, they're actually spans. They can go right in the middle of text, and they don't break onto their own line. So keep that in mind. If you want it to do that, maybe place your image inside of a div so that it does break onto its own line. There is actually one other value for display, and it's called none. And this is when you basically want to completely ignore the tag. Now, be careful here. People often think that display none is the same as visibility hidden. We did that once before. We set something hidden by putting the hidden attribute inside of its tag. Really what you're doing is setting its visibility attribute to hidden. That's different. If you say display none, it truly is ignored. They don't even save space for it on the page. If you say visibility hidden, they still render it and save space for it on the page, but you can't see it. Instead, you just see whatever's behind it. So there is a subtle difference there. Keep that in mind. You'll see people using both in various different ways, so it's important to know what both of them do. So here, let's start playing around a little more with these various tags. Let's give ourselves a new section. And we'll call this playing with blocks. Kind of what we're going to be doing here exactly. Oh yes, let's do H2 instead of H1. That's a good point. It recommended H2 there, and that's actually good advice. In here, I want to create a few interesting blocks. Let's call this a div, and we'll give it the class block. And for now, I'm not going to necessarily put anything inside of it. I'm just going to create several of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And let's just put some numbers inside it. 1, 2. So there we go. And if we go over to take a look at these, we can see that those should all appear on their own lines. So here we are playing with blocks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Kind of like paragraphs. Paragraphs actually get a little bit of padding around them in addition to being on separate lines like divs do. Let's style these a little bit. So I want to come over here and say class, or excuse me, the class block should have the following styles. Now, what are some of the things we can do here? Let's go ahead and give these a border. Let's make it like 4 pixels, solid, green, because the W3 Schools likes to do that a lot. I'll put those on there. Let's see what we get. There we go. Nice, big, thick border on there. Let's also play around with the box a little bit. Let's give this some padding. Let's give it 3 pixels of padding. This will be inside the border, a little bit of padding on the inside of the cell. Let's see what we get there for that. So you see now extra space sort of appeared around the inside of it. Let's also give it some margin. Let's give it 5 pixels of margin. Now this is extra space that appears outside of the border. So this will be a margin between the cells, not around the content. And there you go. You can see we got a little extra space around the outside of it. So this is, that's again that box model. You have margin, border, and padding that you can all play with. And all 3 of those affect it slightly differently. You'll also notice here I put these 2 on the same line. That's perfectly fine. You can put them all on their own lines, but padding and margin are kind of interrelated. I conceptually feel like you can put them on the same line, and that's fine too. Do what feels right here, but don't put everything on one line. I don't like lines to get too long, because then you have to make them really small to view them on smaller displays, and nobody likes that. Let's play around with some other things. One of the other things that we can control with CSS, and that they want you to control with CSS, is sizing. One of the things here, let's give each of these a width value. Now you can specify width several different ways. You can specify it in pixels, of course. So let's say each one of these is 300 pixels wide. We're used to specifying pixels. And there you go. You see it actually constricts them to only be that wide. You can also specify them in percentages, though. So let's say we want them to be 1/3 of the page, so 33%. By using percent instead of px, it will pick that up. And it will always resize these to stay 33% of whatever its parent is, but its parent is essentially the section which spans the whole page. And you'll see, as I change the size, these are now resizing. Of course, when I was over at 300 pixels, it won't do that. They'll just stay at 300 pixels and never change. There we are. So you can decide for yourself which one makes more sense. Now, let's try something else. Let's go ahead and put all these together. We have them as divs right now. But let's say I actually don't necessarily want them to all be on a new line. Well, if that's the case, I actually want to change their display. Remember that the display property, the two key things are either block or inline. It defaults on div to block. But for this particular one, maybe I actually do want these to flow a little bit. Let's mess with that and see what we get. Let's say display inline, which is different from the default. Go back to these, refresh, and there they are. Now notice, this actually had a pretty profound effect on all of these. It's no longer paying attention to width anymore. The display is now because it's set to inline, it's grabbing these and just automatically sizing them to their content, which is not necessarily what we want. Also, when we try and break them across lines, we get a bit of a funny effect. So I've often found with all of these, as you start to combine them together, you start to get some counterintuitive results, and this is where you have to have a real deep understanding of how CSS is supposed to work before you can usually get the results you intend. Now I'll try and give you just some basic tips here to play with these things and make them do the sorts of things you'd expect them to do. But of course, if you want to get deeper into this, there's entire other classes that really will help you become a pro at CSS. What I'd really like these blocks to do is still pay attention to the width that I'm getting them, but I would like them to be in line all in a row. To do this, we have a couple of things that will help us. The float property can help us push these around a little bit so that they will move to the left or the right. Let's see if we can play around with that and get what we want. Display inline didn't quite do it. Let's try float left. And this should cause these to float to the left side of the screen. Now, because I didn't change these so that they were inline style, they're still doing block style, and you can see here that now they sort of all stack up and float along. And much like content that you might have in Word or something like that, they will constantly try and fill the area that they're in. But as we do this, we're sort of getting a weird behavior now. Our footer has gotten kind of broken. That's because float things always try and leave room for the content that comes after them to the other side of where they floated to. So these are floated over to the left. That means they'll leave room, any extra room at the right is going to be filled by the things underneath them. Very often we don't want that. So in order to avoid that, what we have to do is put a little bit of styling on the next part, everything that comes below this. So to achieve this, we would basically want to take our last couple of things here, or really this HR that comes right after it would be a good way to do it. And we need to tell it not to do that. I'm going to do this inline here because it's sort of a fix. We say clear left. This says don't allow things to float to my left. Keep that area clear. And let's see if that fixes it for us. It does. So now the HR isn't going to try and render over there. It renders down here, and then as it picks up the other things, it'll put those where we'd expect them to. What we've created here now is something kind of interesting. We have these things that have a fixed width, and depending on how wide our page is, it'll try and stack as many of them together as it can, but it will also put them on top of each other if there isn't room. This type of behavior is often called responsiveness. It causes the page to either be filled left to right no matter how much width it has, and if you have a narrower device, like a phone that you're holding in your hand, they'll be stacked on top of each other. We'll talk later on about some suites of predefined styles that do precisely this kind of behavior for us and do it really well. But here you can actually see how they're achieving it. Now, in fact, there's an even better way to do this where you don't have to use the float and clear remarks to make it happen. There's a more advanced type of display called inline block that we can use. If we use inline block, then this avoids that whole problem that we ran into of needing to clear things. So let's go back over here, and we'll go into our style. And where we have our block right here, let's do one other thing. Let's also give it a height of 200 pixels so that they're a little more square of a box. Let's take out the float command. And instead, let's say display inline block. Inline block is a newer feature that sort of replaced this need to do floating and having the clear commands to clear out space. It's basically meant to achieve exactly what we're trying to do. This might sound kind of weird. Of course, we talked before about how things are either inline or they're block. When they're inline, they stay inside of the thing that they're in, but when they're block, they have a new break that comes around them so that they begin a new section. Inline block attempts to combine those two things. I think W3 Schools kind of says it the best. It says, inline block elements are like inline elements, but they can have a width and a height. That's basically the only key difference. And let's see here if they talk about, no, they don't talk about it in more detail. Maybe it's over here in display. I remember there was somewhere where they talked about how this works a little better. Let's go to the actual display property here. There's inline block. Here, displays an element as an inline level block container. The inside of the block is formatted as block level box, and the element itself is formatted as an inline level box. So the div itself is going to be treated as inline, and it will let it flow in a line, but the content inside of it will be treated as block level and allowed to and broken apart. So let's save this and see what we actually get now. Come back here to Advanced CSS. Remember, we resized these now to be 300 by 200. And you'll see we get much the same result that we were getting before, just they're resized now. Let me shrink this a little bit. Had it zoomed in there. And you can start to see how these sort of stack up in a nice grid sort of manner. Let's also do one other thing here. We had added this clear left in there to solve the problem we were getting before when we floated. We now should not need that because the display of these things goes back to its default. It's no longer inline block, it's either block or inline. And so that solves these problems that we're having here so that we no longer have to worry about things below it behaving the same way. Only the things that are marked inline block will have this sort of feature where they relay themselves out as you have more or less space. It also means that we don't have to worry so much about positioning of these things, whereas float was all about position. Do you float to the left? Do you float to the right? Here, you just mark them as inline block, and they behave more or less the way we would expect them to. The last thing I want to talk about is the actual position attribute. So here, we played with the display attribute. Display itself, remember, has to do with how it positions itself relative to the things around it. Where we have block level displays, they always start on a new line and give some space around themselves compared to the things around it. The classic one is paragraph, and the most generic one is div. Then we also have inline things, and inline things stay in line with the stuff around them. They don't have a hard break. And the classic examples are things like span, being the most generic, and then also anchor or image. Those are things that default to being inline. Lastly, we explored the newer idea of inline block and how that can allow you to let things sort of position themselves according to how much space they are given. Let's now create one more div here. This one, I'm going to give an ID. Let's call it fixed BR. Understand what that means in a minute. This content should be fixed to the bottom right of the window. And I'm going to put a BR in here because I want to make sure this flows onto two lines. So there we go. Let's use some styling now to make this actually do what this says. If we go over and try and render it as it is right now, it's just going to show up below this with no styling around it at all. So let's make it do what it actually says. So this is an ID, so we use the hashtag fixed BR. And let's give it a few important features here. Border, let's give this one 4 pix solid light blue. And then let's give it some padding again. I like the 3px and a margin, about 5px. And let's not give it any particular width or height. We'll just let it size it the way it wants. Now, if I want to get it to be positioned in the bottom right, I'm going to have to do something a little more creative here. First of all, by doing these things, I at least give it a border, padding and margin, the usual things that we've talked about with the box model. But it doesn't really position anywhere in particular. It just flows along with the normal positioning rules. Now there is a CSS property called position. Let me see if I can find it here. Oh, these are in order, aren't they? Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Let's back up here a notch. Yes, I want to be in the tutorial. And where do they talk about position? Ah, there it is. It's just below display. By default, things are positioned statically. And static, really the best thing to say it is this is the default. These are the rules that you are used to. So by and large, just think about what it would do if you didn't change anything. That's the static positioning. We also have three other options: relative, fixed, and absolute. The one that I want to experiment with is fixed. So here we go. We're going to say position fixed. And save it like that. Let's see what happens when we do that. Now, it goes right to a particular location in the middle here, but it's definitely not doing quite what we want. Whenever you change something's position to something other than static, you usually also then need to tell it what that position will be. When I say fixed, I'm telling it I want it to stay fixed to the browser window. And the fancy word for that is the viewport. It's the extent of the window itself. I then need to tell it where that position is. And so you'll notice this also includes bottom and right. That's how we give it some things. We're saying from the bottom, come up 0, and from the right, come out 0. And that'll position it in the bottom right. Let's put all these together here. At least it should if I've done this correctly. Let's go ahead and refresh this and see what we get. And there it goes. Now here's the really interesting thing. It stays fixed to the window, even as I'm scrolling. That's one of the key examples here of content being different. The position value means this is fixed to the window. You'll also notice some other things. I can see right through it. We have things that are overlapping one another. So I can fix that actually really easy by changing its background color. So we gave it a light blue border. Let's give it also a background color. And for that, let's do hashtag 00bb00. That should be a fairly light blue, I believe. And let's see what we get. Oh, it's green. Of course it's green, sorry. 00bb. Actually, that's going to be a fairly dark blue. Yeah, what am I thinking? Let's try and do, how do we make this a really light blue? Here we go. We'll do BB, 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 FF. So it's nearly white. If we'd done F all the way across, it would be white. But we're going to give it just a little more blue than everything else. And then that gives it that nice little sort of background right there. And now it at least blocks everything that's behind it. Not necessarily in a good way. There's one other thing that's important when you start thinking about stuff being able to be positioned on top of one another, and that is the order in which things are drawn. You can also introduce the value z index. It pops up right away here for us. Normally, it's done automatically, and everything is kind of kept in a z-plane according to how recently it was drawn. But let's say I want to pull this one back. I want to make sure that it always stays behind anything else on the screen. Well, I can give it a z-index of -1. And now, as it draws it, it will always be drawn behind everything else. So this is another property that often plays together with position, since when you're doing position, you can cause things to be drawn on top of one another. So fixed is a particularly useful one, so make sure you know about fixed and you play with it. Ultimately, you should read about the other options for positioning as well. Come on over to the CSS schools and read about relative and absolute. These can be used to also do some very interesting things. However, it is important that you keep in mind as you start combining these together and working them with one another, positioning is going to get a lot more difficult. So I will leave these ultimately for you to read about, maybe explore a little bit in the try it yourself examples. Some of these will come up in the tooltip example that I'm wanting you guys to work through on the homework. So make sure you understand how they're being used and what the ultimate effect is. Probably the trickiest one is going to be relative, because they're going to use that in the tooltip example, so they can draw something relative to the tag or element that contains it, its parent in the relationship. And that helps you to position it in a much more effective way, rather than just positioning it in some absolute way around the screen, like in the bottom right corner.